Thank you, Kirk, and thank you for all of you for coming. You're in for a real treat. I'm delighted to welcome my friend Lucan Way to BYU. Lucan is a PhD from the University of California, Berkeley, and we met when I was doing a sabbatical there in the late 90s, and he is now a professor in the University of Toronto and also the co-director of the Ukrainian Studies Center there at the university. He has written very widely on both democratization and on authoritarian regimes. He's a member of the editorial board of the Journal of Democracy. And indeed, he has written on things sort of in between those two, where he and his frequent co-author, Steven Levitsky, coined the term competitive authoritarianism to try to distinguish a new class of mostly post-Cold War regimes that seem to be neither democratic nor fully authoritarian in the way that we had been used to. That book was published in 2010 by Cambridge University Press. And he also has a sole-authored book from Johns Hopkins called Pluralism by Default. He is currently working with Levitsky on a new book on the durability of revolutionary regimes, and we'll be presenting the Soviet chapter of that book in our department tomorrow. But we're delighted now to have him to talk about the durability of the Soviet regime, and I hope you'll join me in welcoming to BYU Lucan Way.
Thank you, Wade. It's a real pleasure to be here. This is my first time at BYU. I had a great experience in Wade's class just now, really impressive students. So this is a presentation on a book that I'm writing with my co-author, Steven Levitsky, which basically looks at why it is that regimes founded in violent revolutionary struggle tend to be much more durable. And what we find, we've done a data set of all dictatorships since 1900, and we found that on average, those born of violent revolutionary struggle tend to last much longer than those non-revolutionary regimes, 41 years as opposed to 17 years. And it's not just that these revolutionary regimes survive for a long time, but they've survived severe crises that would destroy most other authoritarian regimes. Large-scale famine in the Soviet Union, China, in the 30s and 50s. Severe economic downturn. We're talking like, massive depression-style economic collapses in Russia in the 1930s, Cuba in the 1990s. Severe external pressure. Vietnam, Russia after 1999, Iran. Everybody hates Iran. And yet Iran survives. And also self-inflicted chaos. It's most clear during the China during the Cultural Revolution, when Mao basically unleashed a quasi-civil war in his own country. But before we sort of talk about the durability of revolutionary regimes, I want to be clear about what I mean by revolution. The term now is used very broadly, can mean basically anything. I mean, the way it's used, we talk about the Arab Spring, Arab revolutions, and typically it's used to kind of describe any case in which you have mass protest and the government falls. I have a much more narrow definition, much more kind of classic definition that refers back to work of political scientists such as Samuel Huntington and Theda Skocpol. And I define the revolutionary regimes as authoritarian regimes founded and led by movements from below, outside the old state, that have engaged in sustained violent struggle from below, for power, and whose establishment is accompanied by significant transformation of the state and efforts to radically transform the social order. So these are cases in which you have not just transfer of power at the top, but a destruction of the fundamental state and army and society, efforts to basically reshape who has power, who has wealth, right? Or efforts to impose Sharia law, change basic social mores in society, right? These are cases like the Iranian Revolution of 1979, Russia in 1917. These are very rare events, but very important. And I compiled a data set with my graduate students. We've identified, I think it's 18 or 19, correct me if I'm wrong, cases here since 1900. So not that many. This is out of about 345 authoritarian regimes, about 19 cases. And if you look at these cases, some have collapsed very quickly, like the Taliban in Afghanistan, Khmer Rouge in 1975, Nicaragua. But the vast majority have survived for 25 years or more. About 80% survived for more than 25 years, and a 2/3 survived for more than 35 years. So these have been, and the average tenure for authoritarian regime is about 17 years. So this is a very long time. And so the question is why? So why do these regimes founded in violent revolutionary struggle, why are they so durable? Why do they remain in power for so long and in the face of such enormous crisis? Now, I'm a political scientist, so, correlation does not equal causation, and there may be other things going on here. And one of those things is political parties. Now, in the political science literature, Barbara Geddes from UCLA has talked about the fact that authoritarian regimes which have strong political parties, and we tend to think of political parties as important in democracies, but they're also important in authoritarian regimes. She and many others argue that they create sort of elite cohesion. In other words, they allow the regime to prevent major defections from the regime and therefore allow it to survive for longer. And indeed, in my analysis, having a strong ruling party, which I can talk about what that means, is a strong predictor of authoritarian survival. And indeed, almost all revolutionary regimes, with the sole exception of Iran, have strong parties. So you might think, well, maybe it's not revolution at all. It's the fact that these cases have parties which the political scientists have told us is what actually is causing durability. Now, I'm skeptical of this for several reasons. The first is that revolutionary origins is a significant predictor in statistical analysis of durability, even when we control for party. And in fact, the substantive importance of revolutionary origins is substantially greater than for parties as such. Furthermore, if you look deep in the cases, and this is where I sort of do most of my work, I'm very much of a case study guy, is that there are significant periods in all these the most important cases in which the party itself as an institution is enormously weak. It was weakened under Stalin in the Soviet Union, Mao in China. Iran basically has no party now. And also, if you look at the early years of places like Cuba and Mexico, which eventually developed parties, they did not have parties for any kind of party for the first 10 years. So, clearly party is not sufficient for understanding the durability of these regimes. And in fact, one of the interesting things about these revolutionary regimes is that almost all are born weak. When they come to power, they barely control the capital. There are these kind of loose coalitions, as was the case with the Islamic Republic of Iran. When it came to power, it had to deal with nationalists and socialists and sort of this kind of unwieldy coalition. In Russia, the Bolsheviks under Lenin basically controlled Petrograd, the capital, and nowhere else. Had no army, and weak control over the country and state. And then so let's say you're in that position. So why are these regimes that are born so weak survive for so long? That's fundamentally the question. And so when these regimes come to power, have weak support, isolated from the world, you might think the rational thing would be for these emerging leaders to make friends, to buy off friends, to sort of distribute the wealth, to get more allies in order for them to stay in power. That would be what I would do if I was a dictator. No one's given me that opportunity yet, but that's what I would do. But these guys do something totally different, which is they do, what do you think that refers to? Crazy shingles. As my 6-year-old twin boys say, the S word. I won't say it because, polite company. That took a lot of restraint on my part. I just tell you, I come from a family of swearers. I have to admit it. So, and my wife, I'll get in trouble with my wife if she finds out I swore at a talk. So, okay, crazy shingles. So they do crazy shingles. Basically, Khomeini comes to power in Iran in 1970. He takes over the embassy of the most powerful country in the world, like basically stick it in the eye of the United States. He sort of declares that not only does he want to gain power in Iran, but he wants to take over the Persian Gulf monarchies like Saudi Arabia. So he just takes and he also, by the way, hates the Soviet Union. So he just basically everything declares war on the world, which is what most revolutionary regimes do. And irony is that what this does is it ultimately, what it does is it creates military conflict, counter-revolutionary war, which in turn creates powerful sources of durability. A sort of strong siege mentality and cohesion, a strong and loyal army, and the elimination of any kind of alternatives to the power structure, which in turn leads to durability. So if you're able to survive the sort of initial period of conflict, you get regimes that are incredibly durable. Now, I just want to go over these three things. First, revolutionary war in which basically, because they engage in efforts to transform both the domestic environment, sort of how wealth is distributed, destruction of private property, and the international environment, in other words, challenge regional powers like the United States, they basically face existential threat from both sides, from below and above. And as a result, they have this sort of sense of life and death struggle, which increases strong sense of cohesion. In other words, if any kind of deviation from any kind of defection from the party is basically equated with treason. So this hyper siege mentality. Second, engagement in war forces them to create new and powerful armies. War motivates building a strong military. This is well established in the political science literature. And also, what I show is that the fact that they have to create these new armies, because these are outsiders coming from below, it means that in contrast to most authoritarian regimes who sort of have an army which pre-existed the establishment of the regime, these regimes, the ruling party itself creates its own military regime. And as a result, there are incredibly close, tight-knit ties between the ruling party and the military that does not exist in other regimes. Now, what's important is that this leads to far fewer military coups. Now, if you look at the authoritarian literature, in fact, most ways that authoritarian regimes die is not through mass protests and the like, it's through military coups. Basically, the military has the guns, and they take over power. But this happens a lot in non-revolutionary regimes, almost never in revolutionary regimes. And finally, war leads to the destruction of alternatives. Basically, old army, the church, other parties that can form sources of opposition. As a result, when the revolutionary regimes come to power, they're sort of left with an empty plane. There's basically no viable competitors for power, which allows for their durability. Okay, so that's basically, in a nutshell, the theory. I want to talk about sort of the kind of paradigmatic case of this kind of revolutionary durability, the Soviet Union. Oops. The USSR, which no longer exists. Some of you probably don't even know what it is. It once existed, and we tend to think of it, if we know about it, we know it because it collapsed. Well, it was actually quite a durable authoritarian regime. It survived for 74 years between 1917 and 1991, and which is, given the fact that, again, the average length of authoritarian regime survival is about 17 years. This is very long. Basically, the only kind of regimes that survive longer are basically kind of the Persian Gulf monarchies like Saudi Arabia and the like. And it's not just that they survived for 74 years. They survived enormous crises, mass rebellion, death of a founding leader, and others, and most momentously, the invasion of Germany in 1941. So I'm going to sort of do a kind of whirlwind tour of Soviet history, focusing on these three crises. Excuse me for any historians out there. I'm going to sort of kind of run roughshod over facts and whatever, and hopefully you can complain to me, and hopefully I don't get the reality too out of whack. And basically, so the argument here, so one argument about, I don't know what happened here. One argument about Soviet durability is that it was found that Soviet durability was a result of a strong ruling party, the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, which Samuel Huntington, famous political scientist, called the ultimate organizational weapon. And indeed, Lenin, Lenin created this party in 1903 about 15 years before he came to power. And so you might think, well, okay, if the party, as we mentioned in the literature, is so important, maybe it was just what explains Soviet durability is the fact that Lenin was smart enough to come up with the idea of creating this ruling party, and that's what explains Soviet durability. The problem with this approach is that, first of all, the party itself was not Leninist, and when we think of Leninism, we think of tight discipline, was not really tightly disciplined or Leninist until for a long time. First of all, for the first 15 years, the party was incredibly chaotic, right? And furthermore, then after they came to power in the 30s, Stalin, when the party was ruled by Stalin in 1937, he basically wiped out the party. He basically killed literally 80% of the regional leadership of the party in 1937. So if the party was so important, how did it survive, the utter destruction of that party? And this is, by the way, about 3 or 4 years before the Nazis invade the Soviet Union. And basically my argument here is that Bolshevik radicalism led to polarization, which led to civil war in 1918, and the civil war, basically what happens in Russia is that the Bolsheviks seized power in October of 1917 in the capital. At this point, they have control over almost none of the country. They basically declare war on the ruling class, on the international capitalist order. As a result, you have this civil war, which lasts for about 3 years between 1918 and 1921. And the Soviet Union only kind of established its control over the territory in 1921. And basically, you have this intense existential threat for both domestically and internationally. In Lenin's famous mixed metaphor, Russia is a socialist oasis in the middle of a raging imperialist sea. I quite like that quote. Sort of sums it up. And it creates this hyper siege mentality, this fear of counter-revolution. Literally, they're afraid of spies and enemies everywhere because spies and enemies are everywhere. So it goes from a party that's into intellectual discussion to one that's hyper-focused on the importance of unity above everything else, because that's what it's going to allow the first, the Soviet Union is the first socialist state, right? And the only way to prevent counter-revolution is to make sure that the party is unified. Because if the party is not unified, counter-revolution and counter-revolution will take over and communism will be destroyed. Second, it leads to the creation of a powerful security services, the KGB. This is the one part of 1917 legacy which is still with us, right? You still have a powerful coercive apparatus, remnants of the KGB in Russia today. The party is gone. The security services are still there, as most of you probably know. And finally, it led to the destruction of every kind of institution outside of the Bolshevik Communist Party that could potentially challenge it. Landowners, the old army, other socialist parties. So when the Soviet Union emerges in 1921, the country's been destroyed. There's famine everywhere. But the Bolshevik Party, Lenin's Communist Party, is the one party standing. And they basically have no competitors, which is a big reason why they're able to survive for so long. So what explains the survival? And I argue that this revolutionary origins explains, I'm talking about 3 different crises. The first crisis that it survived was something called the Kronstadt Naval Uprising in 1921. I don't expect anybody of you have heard about this. The Kronstadt Navy was a navy based in the capital of Petrograd, which was one of the first core supporters of the Bolshevik Revolution in 1917. They were core supporters of the Bolsheviks, basically like when we think of evangelicals in the Republican Party in the United States or African Americans in the Democratic Party. They were the core supporters. So it was in 1921 when they rebelled against the Bolsheviks, against Lenin in 1921, it would basically be like if the African Americans in the United States said, okay, we're done with the Democratic Party. There's a really existential threat to this, the Bolshevik power. And at the same time, there was enormous dissatisfaction and unhappiness with the Bolsheviks in 1921. They had destroyed the organized opposition, but no one liked this regime. Everybody was starving. So there was a lot of sort of pent-up opposition that potentially it could have easily led to the destruction of the Bolshevik regime. And what was so threatening again was that these were true revolutionaries, the Kronstadt Navy. And you might imagine they would have gotten support from elements within the Lenin's Communist Party, Bolshevik Party, because they clearly had revolutionary cred. At the same time, everybody understood that any kind of fragmentation of the ruling party would lead to counter-revolution. So even socialists who supported the David Kronstadt, they sympathized with him, they thought they were the real revolutionaries. They also understood that if the party fragmented, then the whites, the counter-revolutionaries, would win. As a result, this fear of counter-revolution led to everybody to support the Bolsheviks, even if in their hearts they supported the Navy Kronstadt. At the same time, you had a powerful army which was able to put down, this powerful army which emerged out of civil war, which was able to put down this protest. So this is the first crisis that they survived. And both these things are a direct result of these revolutionary origins. So now that's sort of what we might call an exogenous crisis, in the sense that this was sort of protest. It didn't happen because of its revolutionary origins. You had also a series of endogenous crises, by which I mean, one of the things, the interesting thing about revolutionary regimes, it's not just they survive crisis, but their revolutionary origins foment crisis itself, because you have a lot of these crazy people coming to power, doing crazy shingles, and which in turn sort of leads to crisis. And this, we see this especially with the collectivization and famine in 1929, 1930, and with the Great Terror in 1937. I don't have time to go over both of these, but I want to talk about the Great Terror. Now, the Great Terror of 1937, 1938 is a remarkable event, because what you had there was normal authoritarian regimes kill opposition. That's sort of what authoritarian regimes do. Love it, hate it, that's what they do, right? What happened in the Soviet Union in 1937 was that the party consumed itself. As a result of this Great Terror, between 50 and 60% of the party as a whole was killed. When they purged, they literally meant purge. They literally killed them. And as I said, 80%, just get your mind around that, 80% of the local party apparatus was killed. So the party was destroyed. So two questions. Why would they do that? Why would you destroy your own party? And two, how would you do it successfully? And so I think the revolutionary origins explain both. The first thing is that this siege mentality, this fear of sort of what they called capitalist encirclement, this notion that this was the first socialist revolution which was surrounded by capitalism, and that war was inevitable between the capitalist states like Great Britain and the United States and the Soviet Union. And their notion of war preparedness, preparing for this, what they saw as inevitable war, meant two things. First, it meant, in the classic sense, you prepare for what you do, you build a powerful military. But for them, it also meant domestically, you destroy domestic sources of potential opposition, or what they call the fifth column, or so for them it was a two-front thing, that preparing for war meant not just building up a strong military, but destroying any classes of people who might potentially oppose you in the midst of military conflict. So the irony is that to prepare for war, they killed a lot of their own people, which to most of us thinks, oh, why would you do that? But in the sort of, if you're a Bolshevik who's lived through this period of counter-revolutionary conflict in the Civil War, in which the spies were everywhere, then it kind of makes sense. You got to destroy your enemies, because the last thing you want is when the enemy armies are marching in for peasants to sort of suddenly rise up against you. Then you're really in trouble. So better to deal with the peasants and ethnic minorities first, so when the armies march in, no one can oppose you. But then the question is, okay, this was, and actually, archives have shown that this war, this fear of war, which emerged in the 1930s because of the rise of Germany and fascism, was indeed a major reason behind the terror. It's how they framed the terror was in terms of the fear of war. But how were they able to carry that out? Because, again, you sort of have this case. It's one thing for Stalin to sort of think this, but it's another for him to be able to get people to actually carry it out. And part of it is because you have this siege mentality which pervaded the bureaucracy, in which this sort of conspiracy theories that Stalin was proposing seemed very plausible because they had experienced this during the Civil War. At the same time, you had a strong security apparatus which gave them the capacity to kill 80% of the party apparatus. So you both had a sort of siege mentality that people went along with the terror, even lower level bureaucrats who suffered from the terror, as well as a strong security service that allowed them actually to carry it out. And to sort of give you a sense of how crazy this was, it wasn't just the lower level party apparatus that killed. It was members of the elite's family. Stalin's own family suffered enormously in the Great Purge, the Great Terror. So this is, I think this siege mentality, made in the mind of a Bolshevik in the 1930s who went through this horrible civil war, this has really kind of made sense. Which brings us to probably the most significant crisis that ever faced an authoritarian regime in the last 100 years, which was the Nazi invasion of the Soviet Union in 1941. Now, I imagine some of you have heard about this. What was remarkable about this is that during the initial stages, basically the Germans completely destroyed the Soviet state, which was a direct result of Stalin's own incompetence. By the 1930s, Stalin had gained total control over the Soviet Union, and he, in 1939, made a pact with Germany against the West, and the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. And he, at the same time, in 1939, so Hitler basically, Stalin wanted to stay out of the war, out of World War II. He makes his pact with Hitler. At the same time, he's getting all these reports that Hitler is about to attack Russia. And Stalin says no. He doesn't think that Hitler's going to invade Russia. And so he refuses to engage in all sorts of efforts to prepare the military for imminent Nazi invasion, even though it was widely understood. There was literally hundreds of reports saying that Hitler was going to invade Russia. And what happens is utter chaos. You have about 3 million Soviet citizens taken prisoner, 2 million dead. The entire basically army just collapses in western parts of the Soviet Union in the first weeks of the war. This is utter disaster. Now, ultimately, of course, the Soviet Union wins World War II for reasons that have nothing, many of which have nothing to do with revolutionary origins. Lend-Lease, crappy Russian winters, the size of Russia. So my argument cannot explain those things, like do not explain Lend-Lease or the size. A lot of revolutionary regimes are quite small. But what I think my theory does do is explains the initial weeks of the war when none of those things really mattered. It wasn't winter yet. The size of the country didn't matter. And if there's any leader who deserves to be couped, I don't know if that's a word, but I just made it up right now, suffer a coup, it was Stalin in 1941. He had clearly mismanaged the country and caused a major crisis. And indeed, he, according to memoir literature, was terrified of a coup. And there's a point at which he gets so distraught by the results of the war that's this utter disaster after disaster in the first week that he basically holds himself up in his summer house and just turns off the lights and just sits there. And then the Bolshevik, the members of the Politburo leadership are like, what are we going to do, man? So they come, and he's like, and according to one report, they say, he basically assumed they were coming to arrest him. But it didn't happen. No one challenged the party. There was no mass uprisings. You would think also that there would be mass uprisings. The major theories of protests say that the protests happen during what they call when there's an opportunity to protest. And when the state collapses, that's a great time to protest because the regime is weak and you have mass protests. And since Stalin had already killed millions and millions of people, you would think there'd be a reason to protest. But I think the revolutionary origins explains, first of all, why that the Soviet Union was able to kill so many alternative power centers that basically Stalin and the party were the only thing left that prevented any kind of uprising. And at the same time, this tight fusion or link between the party and state meant that there was, the opportunity for coup was basically nil. So as a result, the Soviet Union survives really an enormous crisis. And so my theory cannot explain, there are lots of parts of Soviet durability that occur after this, the World War II and the like. I can't, and in a sense, the legitimacy of the Soviet state really changes after World War II. It's not so much in the Civil War and the Revolution, but more in the Soviet Union's success in World War II. So that's sort of outside my theory, but what I can explain is why it even survived World War II at all. So that is that. Hopefully some time for questions. And basically just to give you a summary of my theory, basically the argument here is that radicalism, you do a lot of crazy shingles, leads to conflict, which in turn leads to durable institutions and cohesion and these durable regimes. And the second thing I just want to talk about is that the sort of contradiction was that revolutionary origins often generate crisis. In other words, revolutions are created and undertaken by people, crazy idealists or crazy ideologues, sort of who create crisis, but the nature of the regime formation allows them to survive that crisis. So, thank you.
So we have some time for questions. We ask for the benefit of our listening audience that you come to the mic that's over here on this side of the room. And if you're a BYU student, just tell us your name and what you're studying.
Hi, Jeff Hardy, professor of history here. Thank you for the fascinating presentation. I suppose my question could be said in one word, and that is ideology, which is something that that you didn't mention in your talk, except perhaps at the end when you said crazy ideologues. And so I wonder how ideology might fit into this, because these revolutionary regimes have typically very powerful ideologies that are mobilizing both to elites, these new elites that we're now talking about in the regimes, and the population itself. So could you just spend a few minutes on that? Yeah, I was expecting to maybe see it on that slide, and I didn't.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. You're right, I did not mention the word ideology. I think it does matter a lot, and primarily it's ideology that drives this sort of radical behavior initially. So it does two things. One, sort of in the Soviet case, you can't understand why Lenin would take on the world without communist ideology. The whole notion of capitalist encirclement is a fundamentally ideological concept, right? So in that sense, you wouldn't have had, similarly in Iran, you wouldn't have had, the Ayatollah wouldn't have, decided to have world Islamic revolution without ideology. That's fundamentally about ideology. So the CS, the crazy shingles, is fundamentally sort of ideological. It's hard to imagine that without ideology. I also think, but then in this view, basic ideology is really important at the beginning, but kind of less important later on. I do think, sort of in the case studies that in the Russian case, ideology is really important because it sort of foments this war scare. So one of the reasons, so what you see in the Soviet Union is they interpret everything as aggressive, and there's this obviously this war scare in 1927 in which there's this kind of minor diplomatic disagreement between Great Britain and the Soviet Union, and which any kind of normal person, this is a minor diplomatic kerfuffle, in the Soviet mindset, which sees capitalist invasion as inevitable, they're just kind of looking for signs of war. So that becomes, this major war scare, which is used by Stalin, but it's quite real, which in turn heightens this sort of siege mentality. And so I think that is important. You also see this in Iran with, today, in 2009, that basically everything sort of opposition is seen as counter-revolutionary, which is very much an ideological concept, which enhances this siege mentality. So I think it's very important at the sort of top area. So, yeah.
Patrick Merkel. I'm a double major in poli-sci and classical languages. I'm really glad you touched on the Kronstadt crisis. I don't think its significance to shaping...
Sorry, what crisis?
Kronstadt.
Oh, Kronstadt, okay.
Could have... I don't think its significance could be overstated. I just want you to refer back to it. Trotsky, as you know, was the one who was called in to put down that rebellion, and until the end of his life, he regretted that as the moment that they lost the democratic appeal of the socialist revolution and the revolution. Do you believe that that signaled the end of the democratic element of communism in Russia?
Yeah, I mean, there are people who say that. A couple of things. One, I think basically the democratic potential of the Bolshevik Revolution died on the day the Bolsheviks took power. So it was very brief. There was really the Soviets, which were the sort of ad hoc forms of worker power, where there's definitely a democratic element to them. The Bolsheviks were formed in opposition, even though it was called the Soviet Union, they were formed in opposition to the idea of these worker councils, and instead ruled by this vanguard party from above. So I think, if you look hard enough, you can see democracy anywhere. I think you have to look pretty hard, I think, democracy. And also, let's talk about Trotsky. Right? It's easy to be a Democrat when you're out of power. Everybody's a Democrat when you're not in power because, of course, that's what, you're the opposition. But I can tell you, there are a lot of differences between Stalin and Trotsky. Trotsky was a much better speaker, much better writer, much better educated. But in terms of this kind of stuff, in terms of the support for violence, Trotsky was exactly aligned with Stalin. There was not an iota of difference. They were both part of the hardcore faction within the Bolshevik Party, which saw violence as absolutely essential to the revolution. So it's a little too convenient that when Trotsky's sitting in immigration in Mexico, I've been to the house, nice house, that he sort of talks about how horrible this was. So yeah, I don't know if that answers your question, but.
Hi, my name is George Garcia. I'm studying international relations and Latin American studies. And looking on the other side of the world and a little bit more recent, what do you, based off of the patterns you've seen, what do you imagine happening in Venezuela within the near future?
So I would not consider Venezuela a revolution. I mean, I think, first of all, I think it's important to say that I do not consider Venezuela a revolutionary regime. This is, there are kind of revolutionary elements to Venezuela, but I think especially now the ideology is quite weak, and wasn't formed in violence. But in terms of, if you wanted to speak more broadly, I think one of the things I think is actually just organized an event on Venezuela, and one of the things I think is interesting about the current regime is that, like revolutionary regimes, the Maduro regime has survived, the Maduro government has survived really massive crisis. I mean, you talk about sort of 80% in poverty and the like. It's, people have been talking about how the Venezuelan regime is about to collapse. I'm sort of wondering, okay, maybe that's the case, but so far, this quote-unquote incompetent Maduro has been able to survive for a pretty long time. And so I think, the question is, and I think like the revolutionary regimes, I think looking at civil-military relations is very important. And so I've talked about a particular way that revolutionary regimes maintain cohesion and sort of unity between military and the ruling party, which is because they were founded together. In Venezuela, there are different ways to skin the cat, right? And so Maduro's way, which is really fascinating, is very different. The army was founded separately from the ruling party, so in principle it should be vulnerable to coups. But what Maduro has done is he's encouraged military leaders to engage in drug trafficking. And why does that prevent coup? Well, because as a result of drug trafficking, all these leaders, fear kind of the FBI and the like, and know that if the regime fell, they would be very vulnerable. So it kind of makes it much harder for them to defect from the Venezuela regime because of fear of criminal prosecution. So it's another way of skinning the cat, but I think that is really key to Venezuela's survival. Any other? Yeah.
My name's Elizabeth Watcott, and I'm studying international relations. And I'm just looking at this list, this database you have here of the different revolutionary autocratic regimes. And I find it interesting that Russia, the Soviet Union has collapsed. It's been collapsed for a couple decades now. And yet China, which obviously is not the same as the Soviet Union, but had a similar birth and similar crises, is still around. Is that because it's maintained these sort of characteristics that your theory gives for revolutionary durability, or are there other factors that play into its success?
So that's a really important question, because I think that the variables I'm talking about that allow for revolutionary durability, they don't survive forever. So, this sort of notion of this intense fear of counter-revolution and siege mentality is something that is most salient while the initial revolutionary generation is alive. So, the guys who fought in the Chinese Civil War, they really cared about ideology and feared counter-revolution. And they also had themselves experience in war. I mean, Deng Xiaoping himself was a great military leader. But I think but there's always this sort of major kind of uncertainty when the revolutionary generation dies off. And there you have enormous variability in terms of what happens after that. So, in China and Vietnam, what you had is basically, an emergence of a set of leaders who, weren't driven by fear of counter-revolution, but instead basically cared about economic growth. And that is just, I think, I hate to say it, it's not very satisfying, but highly contingent, right? I don't think there's sort of something in my theory which tells you that this should happen. But I do think that that what happened in China, what the revolutionary origins did was it basically allowed the Chinese regime to survive long enough in order to carry out economic reform. So, as most of you probably know, in 1989 there was a major Tiananmen crisis in China in which basically and this mass protest by students, which created enormous divisions within the younger members of the party, and it was only the sort of elders or older members of the party who had sort of been involved in this civil war, who sort of were used to engaging in large-scale violence, which imposed unity on the regime and therefore allowed the Chinese Communist Party to survive in power in 1989. So I can't explain the revolutionary origins, cannot explain why Deng Xiaoping decided to engage in economic reform, but it can survive why it survived long enough to be able to carry out this reform. And but then you have in other cases less so. I think in Yugoslavia, it's interesting, the Yugoslav Civil War in 1989 was when the last of the generation of partisan fighters during World War II died. They had a very different strategy. I mean, basically the rise of Milosevic in Serbia, they decided to sort of, adopt nationalism as a sort of defining source of legitimacy, which in turn led to the destruction of Yugoslavia. So I think you're right to point out this issue of what happens in the next generation, and I think it varies enormously. At the same time, I do think there are certain things which do remain, so this sort of siege mentality dies off quite quickly after the first generation. However, other parts of the legacy, such as the destruction of alternatives, can remain for a long time, and also these strong sort of party military ties which prevent coups kind of remain intact even after the revolutionary generation dies off. So,
Thank you.
yeah.
I'm Beverly Unra. I'm a communications major.
Yeah.
I was just wondering what was unique about Iran's revolutionary regime that it never developed that strong ruling power you talked of.
Yes, that's a great question. I think, they actually had a ruling party in Iran, the IRP, which was formed in 1979. But then basically, Ayatollah Khomeini just decided he didn't need the party. And I think that was sort of just one of these kind of contingent events. But at the same time, I think Iran does, one of the dynamics of Iran, I mean, I think, while I don't think that the lack of a party has destroyed the regime, Iran is unique in the sense that there's enormous fragmentation at the top, which is, Iran is a really weird regime, right? Because they've remained in power for, 35 years, but there's enormous open contestation at the top. I mean, you just never see this in authoritarian regimes. This open sort of fighting between top leaders of the regime. And so and that I think is a function. So the lack of a party kind of creates this almost constant crisis within the Iranian regime, because you have different factions openly battling it out. And sort of classic political science theory tells you when you have splits in elites, that's when the regime collapses. And so I think that is. But at the same time, the revolutionary origins means that the military is always going to be loyal and strong enough to beat back any sort of serious opposition challenge. So that's, yeah.
Hi, my name is Emmanuel Rialtz. I'm studying international relations. In your theory, again, you said that siege mentality, strong loyal armies, and no alternatives are what help have durability of the revolutionary origins and all of that. So does that also infer that what takes down the regime is the opposite of those three things? So for example, Gorbachev, is it because he opened up the door for alternatives? Is that why it took down the regime? So does that mean there's also other ways, for example, other countries like the US who is dealing with revolutionary regimes, is the way, for example, to help take away that siege mentality or finding alternatives? Just could you maybe share your ideas on how we could look at the other side of the theory and how we could not have durable regimes?
That's a great question. I mean, I think that there are policy implications from this argument, right? Which is that, I think as policymakers, it tells you that there are real side effects to directly challenging, for example, Iran, because you basically help the conservatives in this, because the regime is founded in anti-Americanism, right? So the conservatives within the IRI really, their whole bread and butter, their whole survival is based on America becoming an enemy. And so they love it. They love it when American presidents, criticize them and denounce them, because it just feeds directly, and it makes, it allows them to say, hey, look, we shouldn't become open and democratic because you have these anti-Islamic forces trying to get at us. And so the irony is that for revolutionary regimes, sometimes the biggest threat, I mean, it's interesting, in the Soviet Union too, the Soviet leaders didn't like the Democrats. They wanted Republicans, they wanted sort of, Republican leaders who were aggressive towards the Soviet Union because that sort of strengthened their revolutionary legitimacy. And they didn't know what to do with people like Carter or or in Iran with Obama, who's friendly to them. And so in some sense, the irony is that the best way to challenge some of these regimes is with openness, right? And just sort of, not sort of militarily challenging them. So that, I think that is one sort of, because, by challenging them militarily, you heighten the siege mentality. So I think that's actually a really important point.